Welcome. I'm hoping you're having a fantastic day. Every week I like to go through and highlight some of my favorite decks in Standard. They range from budget decks to decks built by the community that are doing a fun thing, to Mythic decks that have proof that they just recently hit Mythic, as well as top tournament winners. So this week we're going to start things off with a deck from the community. So this is a mono black list from Funderwunk. And the theme of the deck is Lifegain. So I don't know if you've played a lot of Best of One recently, but it has been a lot of mono red aggro decks. So we don't have any sideboard here or anything like that. But the idea is if we're gaining a whole bunch of life, then mono red is not going to be able to deal enough damage to us. So we have a couple of really great cards for gaining life that also remove our opponent's early threats, like Virtue of Persistence. We've also got the Phyrexian Flesh Gorgers, which are a threat that mono red needs to answer, otherwise gaining 3 life a turn is just too hard for them to race. We've got 1 copy of Gix's Command, which is pretty good for the Azorius Soldiers in mono white. Any of the board heavy, even Selesnya Enchantments has a hard time recovering from a Wrath. And you can also give two +1/+1 counters and lifelink. And so this kind of fits into the lifelink strategy. Then, of course, if we're going to be mono black, we've got to have Shieldred, right? And Shieldred also gains life. Every time that we draw a card, we gain 2 life. And then we've got a new card from Wilds of Eldraine, which is Gumdrop Poisoner, which we can create a food token for 1 black as an instant. And then we can we can play it for 3. And when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature gets -X, where X is the amount of life you gained this turn. So we're turning our life gain into removal. And you can also just, pay this for 5 if you want. With the food token is kind of like a built-in -3/-3. But there's so many other ways for life gain to have triggered in this deck that you don't only have to do it as a 5-drop, which I think is kind of a fun little thing. And then Graveyard Trespasser. Right? Every time that this attacks, it removes something, and when it comes into the battlefield, you exile something from their graveyard. If it's a creature card, you gain 1 life. And then it turns into a 4/4 during night, and it has Ward, discard a card, which means that it has to be a 2-for-1 if you're going to remove this card. And then, being able to swing for 6 damage a turn, Graveyard Trespasser can just close out games. And then for the removal, we have your classic 4 copies of Cut Down. We've got the 3 copies of Go for the Throat, as well as 3 copies of Shieldred's Edict. So we've got plenty of interaction to try to shut down our opponent's early plays. And then we got a little bit of land hate. It was this one caught me off guard to see 4 copies of Field of Ruin. But with so many domain decks out there, and so many Mishra's Foundries and Mirrex and things like that, then this being able to remove our opponent's man lands, I'm really curious to see how this plays. Especially if your opponent is playing so many non-basic lands, this can actually end up just destroying a non-basic land that they can't replace, because it has to be replaced by a basic land. So if they've got no basics in their deck, then this is just like a strip mine. This is pretty fantastic. So I'm very curious to see how Field of Ruin is doing in the meta these days. So thank you, Funderwunk, for the submission. Deck number 2 is Simic Cauldron by Skrua, who the island's in front, who manages a lot of the decks on MTGA Zone. And I can't remember if it was 1 week ago or if it was 2 weeks ago, but we had a community request to cover the mono blue Cauldron combo deck. And I mentioned at the time that the stronger version of the deck appeared to be in Temur. Or, well, Simic, because you're really only playing the 1 red card. But so this is the Simic Cauldron deck, and it is it's centered around an infinite combo. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an infinite amount of mana and an infinite amount of damage. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron allows you to put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature by exiling a target card in the graveyard, and then that exiled card's activated abilities, go onto the creature that has a +1/+1 counter on it. So what you're trying to do is use the Sleep Cursed Fairy to give the creature the ability to untap And then if you loop it with the Kami of Whispered Hopes, getting the +1/+1 counter on it, you need to get this thing to 3 power. But then every time that it taps, you get to create 3 mana of any color and then untap it for 2. And so this is how you start the infinite mana loop. And then your infinite amount of damage is once you've got infinite mana of rainbow color, then you can deal 1 damage to any target through Realm Scorcher Hellkite. And so that's kind of the combo. The mono blue version was running Training Grounds, and there were more steps to making this work. But the nice thing about being in Simic as well is that you've got some good enablers in the in green. So Ren and the Realm Breaker. Most of the time you're going to be doing this as a -2 to mill 3 cards and then put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand, with the intention of trying to dig the useful pieces of the combo into your graveyard. Similarly, you also have Jace, which is going to be for self-milling, and then you've got the Philology Archaeologist, that is going to be doing more of that self-mill as well. And you have a fair amount of targets that this actually hits. You can non-creature, non-land, there's a fair amount that falls within that category, so this is pretty good dig. And then we've got Rona, and being able to play the Rona, use it to draw a card, and then discard your combo pieces that you need to get into the graveyard for your Agatha's Soul Cauldron is one of your key enablers. We also have Seed of Hope to do the self-mill. And then we've also got the Teachings of the Kirin, which is also some more self-mill. So a lot of enablers in the deck. And then after that, we've got some interaction, and you're going to see copies of Witness Protection. And the reason why Witness Protection is in here is because it's Simic's cheapest way to deal with your opponent's threats. And if they have something that deals damage to you every time that you draw a card, like Shieldred, there are things that are going to prevent our combos from working. And so Witness Protection is really good for removing those problematic threats that our opponent has played cheaply, so that we can still continue to work on our combo and we don't have to take an entire turn off. And then the last little bit is Unnatural Restoration. Having a little bit of recursion is really nice if we need to get a key thing that shouldn't be in the graveyard back into our hands so that we can play it. For example, like if they had removal for our Kami of the Whispered Hopes. So this is a best of 3 list. So it does come with a sideboard. This one is currently built as the best of 1 version, but anytime there's a sideboard, I like to at least cover it. And so we've got Malevolent Hermit, Outland Liberator, Titania, Voice of Gaia, another Ren and Realm Breaker, Spell Pierce, Tamio's Safekeeping, Negates, Animist's Might, and Titania more copies of Titania, Voice of Gaia, for a total of 4. And then Slogurk, the Overslime, which I wish I could get down to the bottom of the sideboard, but apparently Magic the Gathering's interface is just it's too much. Can't see the last card. But anyway, Slogurk is down there on the bottom. The other thing that I like to include in these deck lists are budget options. So if you are new to Magic the Gathering and you do not have a whole ton of wild cards that you are willing to, throw at whatever constructed deck that you would like to make, then always, whenever I see a decent looking budget option, I would like to present it to my community. So this week, I bumped into a budget burn deck by SaffronOlive, who runs MTGA Goldfish, and has been a long time Magic the Gathering content creator. And so this one, the only expensive card in the deck is Virtue of Courage. I do think that it is the downside to this budget version is that this is a very specific rare or mythic. I don't really see this in a lot of other lists, but the fact that there's only that, and then the rest of the deck is just commons and uncommons, might be worth doing it if you like the mono red burn as an archetype. So basically, Virtue of Courage allows you to play a 2-cost shock at instant speed, and then later play it as an enchantment, and the enchantment doubles the damage of non-combat damage. So all of your burn spells do double damage after you get a Virtue of Courage into play. And so that gives you really excellent reach, and is partly why I don't think you can really just easily replace this with another card for the budget version. But then we've got Play with Fire, classic deal 2, can help you scry, smooth out your land draws. We've got the Lightning Strike, 3 damage to face, and then also Stoke the Flames. And because we're not running a whole bunch of creatures, we dropped the Stoke the Flames down to 2. But even without the ability to convoke, still being able to pay 4 to hit for 4 is pretty good. And we're not running like the lowest amount of lands, so I like this at 2. Very excited to see how this one plays. And then on top of all of the burn spells, we also have pingers. So we have the Monastery Swiftspear, which is the 1/2 haste prowess. It gets +1/+1 whenever you cast a non-creature spell. It's got the Kessig Flame Breathers that deal 1 damage every time that you cast a spell. It's got the Thermo Alchemist, which is a 0/3 defender that can tap to deal 1 damage, and then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it untaps, so it also pings like the Kessig Flame Breather. And then we've got Kumano faces Kakazan, because it pings for 1 damage for 1, and then boosts up one of your smaller creatures. So it's not as amazing in this deck as it might be in like the mono aggro deck, but it's still one of the best red uncommons. And then lastly, we've got a little bit of Dig. So this is running 2 copies of Ren's Resolve and then 4 copies of Reckless Impulse for us to continue to top deck into the burn spells to destroy our opponent. And we've got a little bit of creature-specific removal. We've got 2 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy. And it is a best of 3 sideboard. So we're running, there's 4 Lithomantic Barrages, which is good if you're up against specifically white or blue. We've got Bloody Betrayal, which honestly, I think that this should just be... I guess you get to create the blood token, but I kind of like the Wicked roll of Twisted Fealty from the Wilds of Eldraine set. So I think we could look into, like, I would play around with the idea of maybe sideboarding in Twisted Fealty instead of Bloody Betrayal, but I didn't make the deck. Obliterating Bolt, 3 copies of Furnace Punisher, 2 Vampire's Vengeance, which is a good answer to the Azorius Soldiers in mono white. Any of the go wide board archetypes are nice to be able to smush their hopes and dreams. And then 2 more copies of Witchstalker Frenzy. All right, 4th on the list is Azorius Soldiers, which was used by ThaisM to win first place in the Standard Challenge on the 7th of October. And why it caught my attention specifically is that this is back-to-back first places by ThaisM. So they also got first place in the Standard Challenge on Moto on September 30th. So any deck and any person who wins first place in both events is definitely figured out something in at least the best of 3 meta. It is a best of 3 tournament. So this one is, we covered this one last week when it won first place, and the only change this week was -1 Werefox Bodyguard for +1 Virtue of Loyalty. And I also showcase a deck every single week where I take a deck and go in depth and run it for 50 matches. And this week was Azorius Soldiers. So if you want to see how this deck played out in the best of 1 ladder, look for that video. But the main point of this deck is to take advantage of flash like Resolute Reinforcements and Zephyr Sentinel, both which you can play during your opponent's turn, and so that allows you to keep up mana for counterspells like Make It Disappear and Protect the Negotiators. And so it's a difficult deck to play. It was not the easiest learning curve in my experience, because you have a limited amount of counterspells, and so you have to really choose when you're going to keep the mana open and what play from your opponent you're planning to get rid of. But the main one that you really want to prioritize is Sunfall, especially in best of 3. Any of the board wipes are really hard for this deck to recover. So, but in best of 1, figuring out when to okay, I'm going to try to get this play at this time has been pretty difficult. But still a very enjoyable deck and a lot of fun. We also have the anti-aggro tech build of Lunarch Veteran, which gives you 1 life every time that a creature enters the battlefield. So a Soul Warden kind of effect. And this one's been pretty nice and performing quite well. And then we've also got a little bit of a payoff for the go wide strategy. We've got Knight Errant of Eos for some dig, and then Wedding Announcement to kind of help fuel the token flame, right? And one of the things that's kind of weird about that is that there aren't a whole bunch of soldiers specifically, right? So this creates a 1/1 white human, but it's not a soldier. This is a fox. Lunarch Veteran is a cleric, right? So it's not like your typical blue-white soldiers where everything is a soldier. So I've found Harbin to not be as amazing, where you sometimes, like in blue-white soldiers, you would hold on to it till the end of the game where you could play this and attack with 5 soldiers. That still happens in some games, but a lot of times I'm just playing this out as a 3/2 flyer, just as a threat early on, and I'm like not concerned that I don't have the soldier synergies. So just something to keep in mind if you are used to the more creature-forward Azorius Soldiers deck. This plays out a little bit differently. The best of 3 sideboard is running 3 Destroy Evils, 2 Lantern Flares, 2 Wandering Emperors, and Elspeth Smite, 3 Protect the Negotiators, so the 4th one is over here, and then 3 Takashia's Welcome, and the Werefox Bodyguard that was subbed out. Okay, the 5th deck this week is Selesnya Enchantments by 4am Donuts. Which I love the username, fantastic. They got 2nd place in the Standard Challenge on October 7th. And this one is kind of a different approach than what I've been seeing, or what I'm used to in the previous meta before Wilds of Eldraine. So we're still leaning heavily into the enchantment synergies of Selesnya. So we've got Jukai Naturalist, which is a 2/2 lifelink that mates all of your enchantment spells, cost 1 less to cast. We've got the Generous Visitor, which is a 1/1 that whenever you cast an enchantment, you get to put a +1/+1 counter onto one of your creatures. We've got Spirited Companion, which is a 1/1 enchantment that draws a card when it enters the battlefield. We've got the Restoration of a Gonjo, which usually you see as a pretty a mid-range card. I saw it a lot in the mono-white mid-range deck. But being able to bring back your 2-cost cards like Jukai Naturalist or Spirited Companion from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped if they died is just fantastic. You can use it to basically ramp in white as well. And then we get a 3/4 Vigilance that whenever it attacks or blocks, it creates a 1/1 Spirit Creature token. And the Spirit Creature token does have some synergies later in the game off of Hallowed Haunting. So as long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a 1/1 or create a white spirit creature token, and that spirit creature token is power and toughness are equal to the number of spirits you control. So the fact that this is a 1/1 colorless spirit token does matter with the Hallowed Haunting. And then the fact that this is also a colorless creature token works nicely if you're playing against Skrelv or something like that. That is going to, the colorless thing ends up mattering more often than you would think. But we are, not running some of the cards that I'm used to seeing in the Selesnya Enchantment build. So we've also got Matilda. That one's a great just flying lifelink protection from vampires. It can be just a huge threat that's very difficult for your opponent. But we don't have the +1/+1 to enchantments guy that I can't remember the name. We also don't have Calyx. We don't have the 3/3 that creates multiple copies of your enchantments. So just a different take than I was used to seeing, but 2nd place in the Standard Challenge is doing something well, at least in best of 3. So we've got some more dig than I'm used to seeing. So Commune with Spirits is a classic inclusion. It allows you to look at the top 4 cards of your library and reveal an enchantment or a land. So it can help smooth your early plays as well. But then we've also got Rite of Harmony. Whenever a creature or an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So a little bit more dig than I'm used to seeing. And then also 2 copies of Seed of Hope. Not usually used to seeing this one in the Selesnya Enchantment build. So really curious to see how this one plays. As far as removal goes, we do have the Ossification. We're not going to be copying the Ossification with Calyx, though, so I'm a little curious to see. Basically, this is more of a mid-range strategy, which makes me speculate that it's better in best of 3 than it is in best of 1. But the sideboard, we've got the additional removal of Circle of Confinement. We've got another copy of Rite of Harmony, another copy of Catilda, Wedding Announcement, Vanquish the Horde, or a board wipe. Destroy Evil, Knockout Blow, another copy of Wedding Announcement, the Wandering Emperor, and then Elish Norn, the Mother of Machines, which hopefully I can get a look at here. Okay, yeah. Is a 4/7 Vigilance that whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to occur, it happens an additional time, and then it also squashes your opponents. So all of your enchantments that have an ETB trigger a second time. So I'm not exactly sure about which matchups to bring in what, but that's the sideboard. The sixth deck that caught my attention this week is 4-Color Control, which seems to be the preferred name for the Domain Ramp deck. And this one won first place in the Standard Challenge on the 8th of October. And it is very similar to the lists that we've seen from Reed Duke that I showcased for the 50 matches. And this one is running a 1 less Virtue of Persistence, so we're down to 2. And 1 less Invasion of Zendikar, which I kind of like that, because like sometimes Invasion of Zendikar has felt a little like, ooh, I can't afford to actually just develop the board here, and I would much rather have something else. So I'm curious to see how 3 copies of Invasion of Zendikar plays. But the 2 cards that they added in are Depopulates, and so I really like this. This is like pushing more towards answering Azorius Soldiers, and maybe even works better in Best of 1, where there is more mono red, more mono white, more just these board flood kind of strategies, the Boros Tokens deck. And so putting in another sweeper, and the nice thing about this one is it's a 4-cost sweeper. So a lot of times you're feeling like Sunfall is just a turn short. And so Depopulate gets there on turn 4 and wipes the board. So I really like this inclusion. I think that it's my gut says that it's going to work better in Best of 1 than the other lists that I tried out. It's keeping the Up the Beanstalks, which if you go back and look at the comments on that video, there were some people who were like, you can't cut Up the Beanstalk, it's just too much value. So they're keeping that one, but they are keeping the Courier's Briefcase, which was the suggestion to cut. So very curious to see how this Domain ramp or 4-color control runs in Best of 1. And if it does better than the one that I ran that had more go for the throats, Virtue of Persistence for Up the Beanstalk. But I definitely think this is good stuff. And then for the sideboard, we have Duress, we have Destroy Evil, Disdainful Stroke, Knockout Blow, Negate, Anoint with Affliction, 3rd copy of Up the Beanstalk, Chromhost Seed Shark, which has some nice synergies with Leyline Binding. I've seen that a couple of times as a possibility to play. And then an Obstinate Baloth, which is like the biggest head scratcher of the sideboard inclusion that I can think of, but interesting nonetheless. The 7th deck this week is Golgari Midrange by Edel, and this one won 2nd place in the Standard Challenge on October 8th. And it's fun to see a Golgari midrange deck, because this was one that like a lot of us were speculating was going to do quite well during the release of Wilds of Eldraine, and it hasn't been a top performer, right? So 2nd place is good to see it get up there, and I like their approach. I like the way that they've gone with this. So we have a lot of the mid-range threats, so like Mosswood Dread Knight draws a card and you lose 1 life for the adventure side, so it's kind of a built-in 2-for-1, and then if it dies you can play it again for the adventure side and play it again, and it's got this kind of recurring loop, which if you're able to pull off then kind of gives you a 4-for-1. So as far as value is concerned, this is a fantastic little thing to do. And then Glissa Sunslayer has been sitting around since Phyrexia All Will Be One, waiting for Golgari to get good. And so this one, every time that it connects with your opponent, you can draw a card and lose a life. You can destroy an enchantment. You can remove up to 3 counters from a targeted permanent, so you can like damage your opponent while simultaneously destroying their planeswalkers on the side. And then we've also got Lord Skitter Sewer King, which produces a 1/1 rat and hates on your opponent's graveyard every turn. And then, of course, Shieldred the Apocalypse, the ultimate black threat, right? And then we're kind of balancing this out with a little bit of ramp. So we've got the Blossoming Tortoise, which works wonders with Golgari, because Golgari got the best manland with Restless Cottage. So being able to use Blossoming Tortoise to activate this for 1 less, and then also make it into a 5/5 instead of a 4/4, is just really good synergies. And so that this also ramps us into, we've got Iron Crag and Blossoming Tortoise to ramp into Nissa, the Ascended Animist. So this is a pretty decent payoff for ramping. We have a 7 loyalty Planeswalker if you don't pay the completed cost with life. That can immediately come down and give all creatures you control +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. Or you can just start popping out these XX Phyrexian Horror creature tokens, and every once in a while, maybe you'll use this to destroy target artifact or enchantment. But the other two are so powerful that I don't think you're going to be doing that all that often. But it's a good payoff for the ramp off of the Blossoming Tortoise. And then Lily, there's a ton of removal in the deck, right? We've got Liliana of the Veil, which hates on our opponent's hand if they're playing control. Also, if we've eliminated a lot of their threats, if they only have one thing on the board, we can make them sacrifice it with the Edict effect. Then we've got the Cut Down and Go for the Throat, which is if you're in black, you're going to be running that kind of removal. No surprise there. There are 2 copies of Duress, which if you are up against like a completely mono white humans deck that has no spells, is a little bit of a miss. But we've been seeing more and more spells sneak into the decks, right? Like the Azorius Soldiers deck that I just covered has way more spells than the complete creature list. So I wonder if Duress is starting to become even a consideration in Best of 1. Now, this was a Best of 3 tournament, though, so my gut says no. You're going to want to pull this out for Best of 1. But we've also got Virtue of Persistence, which has been really good for shutting down our opponent's early plays. So lots of really good interaction, lots of ramp and mid-range threats. Golgari is definitely looking like a fun place to be, at least in Best of 3. And the sideboard has the 4th copy of Cut Down, also has a Pilfer, Liliana of the Veil, Path of Perils for wiping out all of the go wide strategies, 2 Phyrexian Arenas if we end up in a mid-range matchup where we need the card advantage in exchange for life, Tranquil Frillback for some artifact and enchantment hate, as well as some gaining life. So a 3/3 that gains life is kind of interesting, right? Curious to see. So you pay forests up to 3 times. So you have to add on to that how expensive this is. But a hill giant that gains 4 life if you're up against aggro, that sort of thing. The end, I want to see more and more copies of this, right? Like the end is really good if your opponent is on a single threat strategy, right? It's like the answer to the Azorius control. And then we've got 2 copies of Gix's Command for some more board hate. All right, and then since I'm a dirty Best of 1 player, I got to include some Best of 1 lists, right? So every week I like to go over some of the top performing decks on Untapped. And Untapped is a tracker. They don't pay me anything, but I do think it's a resource that's worth looking into. So not only will it track your own games, but because people use it as a tracker, it's really great at looking kind of at the meta at large and seeing what's performing well in Best of 3 or Best of 1. There's some paywalls and stuff like that, but definitely look into it. And so this one is a Mono White Humans list, and Mono White Humans looks like the best of 1 deck. And part of it is because it does very well at disrupting Mono Red. So it's hard to say if it is truly the best one or if it's just the counter to the most common deck in the meta right now. But I did run a 50-match summary of Mono White, and I was impressed with it. This one is a little bit closer to the older Mono White list that I ran about a month ago during the Lord of the Rings meta. So this one is not running the Anointed Peacekeepers. It is not running the Extraction Specialists. It is not running it's only running 3 copies of the Hopeful Initiates, no Spellbook Vendors, and no Virtue of Loyalty. So these are just the old cards before Wilds of Eldraine, but it's still a top performing deck. It's got 1 copy of Guardian of New Benalia, which works particularly well against red, since they can't remove it with any of their interaction. Can really slow down and gum up the board. We've got Adeline, which is just a amazing threat. This one's running 4 copies of it instead of 3, so it's just embracing that, like, if we have it extras in our hand, they're going to want to remove it so badly that we can still play our Adeline anyway. We've got 4 copies of Intrepid Adversary, which performs quite well against the mono red build. Sometimes you just playing this out as a 3/1 lifelinker demands that they use their interaction to remove it instead of shooting you in the face. And then if they don't have the answer for it, or if you have Skrelv in play, you can protect it for some recurring life gain. And then we've got the 2 copies of Ossification, mostly to remove threats that our Adeline is going to have a hard time getting over, like Shieldred and such. And then we've got no copies of Mishra's Foundry and 22 lands. So if you compare this to the mono white list that I ran a month ago in Lord of the Rings, it is down 1 Hopeful Initiate for 1 more Skrelv. So very similar. Very curious to see if that was the top performing one a month ago. That's the one that I had the most success with. Curious to see if it's still the top performing archetype in Best of 1. All right, the 9th deck is another mono-white humans deck, but this one is closer to what we were running the last week. And this is how good, I want to emphasize, this is how good that mono-white humans is performing right now in Best of 1, right? Is that, like, you have two decks that are relatively different from one another, and but like similar theme, and they're both top performing decks with over 1,000 matches played. And so this one is running the 4 copies of Hopeful Initiate, the 1/2 that can grow. It's gone down to 2 copies of Skrelv. Doesn't have the Guardian of New Benalia. Is only running 2 copies of the Intrepid Adversary instead of 4. But we're putting in 4 Spellbook Vendors. We're cutting the Brutal Cathars from the list and leaning more into responding to our opponent's removal and bringing back the threats that they've destroyed with Extraction Specialist. So Extraction Specialist can bring back Thalia, Spellbook Vendor, Coppercoat Vanguard. If you have 5 mana, you can bring back an Intrepid Adversary and trigger it again. So lots of really interesting targets for the Extraction Specialist specifically to bring back, and less interaction of our own with the missing Brutal Cathars. But we don't want to have 0 interaction, so we are bringing the Ossifications up to 4. Also, you can notice the Knight Errant of Eos is down by 3, so we're focusing a little bit more on the early interaction, less so on the digging with the Knight Errant of Eos, just to bring the speed of the deck up. And then we've also got 2 copies of Aganjo, Seed of the Empire, and this has been pretty good interaction, especially whenever you got Thalia and Adeline. This becomes so cheap. A 1 cost, deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and it's a colorless. Whenever you channel something, it doesn't hit as a white source of damage, and you can't counter it unless you can counter abilities. So I really like the Aganjo, Seed of the Empire. The only downside is if it's your only source of white and you need to play it as a land, you can't, because it's a legendary. You can only have 1 in play. And then we've got the Mishra's Foundry, 3 copies of the Mishra's Foundry. So I don't know if this was a little bit too taxing on the mana, but I still think it's looking like a top performing deck and a different direction to take it, which is always fun. All right, and the last deck of the week is Azorius Soldiers, and this one is the one I'm more used to, right? This one is the one that is more creature forward, less counter spells and doing the, whatever. This is just like, let's play soldiers and win through soldier synergies. So if you go all the way back to January in 2023, I ran a list that is pretty darn similar to this. So it is, the difference is that instead of focusing on responding to our opponent's threats, with things like Slip Out the Back and Zephyr Sentinel, it's playing Brutal Cathars to remove our opponent's stuff, and then 1 less Myral, Shield of Argive, I think once again just to kind of like speed up the meta, and 1 additional land. This one's running one additional land to the one that I ran back in January, and Mishra's Foundries. So very it's not a soldier, but it gives us at least gives us an answer. The one downside with this deck is that it gets answered by board wipes, right? Like if you're up against the 4-color control or the domain ramp deck or whatever you want to call it, and they play Sunfall or they play Depopulate, this deck has a really hard time recovering from that sort of thing. So being able to play the Mishra's Foundries at least gives us an option to close out the game if we weren't able to actually get the lethal damage in. So thanks for watching to the end of the video. Remember to hit like and subscribe. The ultimate goal is to post daily Magic the Gathering YouTube videos. Some weeks I'm better than others, but every single week I promise I will at least give you my insights on my favorite decks in Standard, and I will give you at least one look at a deck taken to 50 matches. So I hope you all enjoy the series, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.